So if you don't know me, my name is Emily, and I am the Public Outreach Coordinator at the Addison County Solid Waste Management District, and I'm joined here by my friends. Rhonda, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Recycle Rhonda, or you can just call me Rhonda, it's fine as well. I am the school outreach coordinator for Chittenden Solid Waste District up here in Chittenden County.
All right, and then Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Alex Lacey, or Big Al, and I work over at the Wyndham Solid Waste Management District in Brattleboro.
Yeah. Great. So we want to thank everyone for coming out today. This is the first of 3 of our webinar series during our Earth Month EduSeries. So it is Earth Month, which is our favorite time of the year, where we like to talk about the environment, how to properly manage your waste, and you guys can get to learn something from us. So if you don't know what a solid waste district is, we handle a lot of the garbage. So if you are throwing it away, it might be something that we know about. So we are your local resource for all things recycling, compost, and trash. And today we are focusing on one of my favorite topics, vermicomposting. So let's get into it. First, I'm going to ask the audience, what is compost? What do you think compost is? And for this, there are 2 options. We are going to start up a poll or a quiz, but I'm also going to allow you all to talk in case you just want to call out answers.
And I'm not sure if is anybody seeing the poll?
I see the poll.
Or any other participants seeing the poll? You can pop it into the Q&A too if you don't want to chat, but you should be able to unmute yourself and chat if you want to. Oh, I see one person's participated. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So it's almost a minute to. All right.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to end the poll. Share results.
Okay. I can't see any results.
Oh, wait. Whoa. hang on. All right. So I got the results over here. I've never done the short answer thing. So,
Okay.
woo, learning it together here, guys.
Yeah.
So it says recycling organics, and one person said broken down organic matter ready to start over.
Ooh, great. So these are amazing answers, guys. So I like to describe compost as managing the natural decomposition process of organic material. And you might be wondering, what does that mean? Well, organic material are things that naturally break down in the environment, and composting is looking at that natural breakdown and managing it to get a better finished result full of nutrients. Compost is not dirt. Contrary to popular belief, compost is separate from dirt. It is just simply organic matter. And organic matter is dark brown, it's crumbly, it's earthy smelling, and it looks a little bit like chocolate cake. But compost is also alive. It is a living ecosystem with over 1 billion bacteria in an area the size of your fingernail right here. So it's really alive, guys. And I like to think of composting as managing all of those little microorganisms that live inside of your compost pile. And you will have different microbe populations based on what you feed them. And a microbe is all of that little bacteria. So there's different little guys hanging out in your compost pile depending on the ingredients. That being said, compost always has 2 different kinds of ingredients. And that is going to be your browns and your greens. So this needs to be put into a compost pile in a correct ratio. And that is always adding in 1 part greens to 3 part browns. And if you do that in a layer like a cake, you will be composting correctly. You might be wondering, all right, I know that there are 3 parts of browns in here and 1 part of greens. What exactly are browns and greens? So browns are the source of carbon for your compost pile. It is things like hay, straw, little ripped up bits, pieces of paper, dead leaves, dry leaves, wood chips, shavings, newspaper, cardboard, all of that is a type of brown. And they have one thing in common, their color. They are brown itself. The other ingredient is going to be your greens. These can be greens in colors, but they're largely going to be the things that you eat. And your greens are your nitrogen source for your compost pile. And keep in mind the ideal ratio here, it's 3 parts brown to 1 part green. So 1 part of what you eat to 3 parts of some of that dead dry material. And that's really because we want a correct ratio of carbon to nitrogen in our pile. And that is how we manage that decomposition. We use the right ratio to get some nice finished compost. That being said, why do we compost? And this is going to be another fun poll. So you all are welcome to unmute yourself or use the poll function here. Why do you think we compost? All right, I'm waiting for everyone to respond. It looks like we have a couple of responses. So, okay. I can't see the results of the poll. Rhonda, can you, or? No, okay.
Oh, whoops, sorry, I was talking and
Oh,
weird. Oh, hang on a second. Here we go. To give back to the soil and to feed plants.
great. Okay, those are 2 fantastic answers. The truth is, there are a lot of reasons why we would want to compost. I'll go through a couple of them and show you this lovely little graphic. So first and foremost, in the state of Vermont, there is a certain law called the Universal Recycling Law. And this makes it where we have to manage our food waste separately from trash. So you can't really throw food away in the garbage. It's best to put it somewhere else. So it's important to compost to make sure that you are following the law. Secondly, it's a little bit of a waste of our resources if we throw away our food. So if you think about it, you paid for that food, you ate it, and it still has nutrients, even if there's little bits and pieces left that you didn't eat. And if you just throw that away in a landfill, it'll get caught underground where no one can use those nutrients anymore. But if you compost it, it'll be able to help other plants grow. So it's really to manage our resources better, but also you can save money because you're paying for that food. You then don't have to pay for compost later on if you're using it in your garden. And it also helps you save money on some trash disposal because guess what? If you manage your food scraps separately from your trash, you are saving space in there. And something that you guys might not know is that there is only 1 active landfill in the state of Vermont, and we want to save as much space in that as we possibly can for things that need to go in that landfill. Otherwise, we want to manage our materials in a little bit of a different way. Also, there's a lot of carbon emissions involved in landfilling. So if you move something from at least where I am here in Middlebury, it takes about 3 hours to get up to Coventry, where that one landfill is. And that means that as those trucks are moving, there's a lot of carbon emissions coming out of those trucks. And carbon emissions, we don't really want in the environment because they contribute to the greenhouse effect or to global climate change. So we want to minimize those emissions as much as we can, make a small amount of emissions as we possibly can, and just manage those food scraps differently. Because if you compost your food waste, you're actually creating less of those carbon emissions. Because in a landfill, that food will break down anaerobically, which I know is a really big word, but anaerobically means in the absence of oxygen. So there's no oxygen present. It will break down, creating methane, which is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. It is more potent than carbon dioxide by about 20 times as much. So super, super powerful, and we really don't want that in our atmosphere. But in a compost pile, there's less of that created, and it actually breaks down with oxygen present. So the air we breathe in is present in that pile. So as a whole, it creates less carbon emissions and is better for the environment. And it's also great for the environment because compost provides all of that bacteria and that microbes to the soil that makes nutrients available to our plants to help them grow. And it also increases the amount of organic matter in our soil sponge, which also helps plants grow. So it's just a super amazing thing for the environment. That being said, there are a lot of different ways to compost. So the next question will be, how can you compost? And feel free to just type as many answers as you want here or call out. How do you think you can compost? All right, and it's okay if you guys don't know because I'll go through one way later on, but let's see. Okay, we have one answer. Does anyone else want to take a guess? Two, all right. Okay, I'll let it go to a minute and then I will end the poll. And Rhonda, if you want to help out and read those answers, that would be fantastic. All right.
All right, so many compost containers available and do-it-yourselfers. Also, just start a pile and go with it.
Exactly.
And another one is right now in a bucket that's picked up by Casilla. Fantastic.
There we go. So that is actually perfect. So there are lots and lots of different types of compost, but I find that the three most common types, at least in my area, little neck of the woods, are vermicomposting, which we were talking about today, compost pickup, or just backyard composting. So vermicomposting is composting with worms. Compost pickup is just putting it in a bucket and having your garbage hauler come and collect that for you to bring it to a compost facility. And backyard composting is DIY, just starting a pile, doing it a million ways. Today, what we are focusing on is just vermicomposting. So vermicomposting or worm composting is the use of specifically red wiggler worms to turn your food scraps or your kitchen waste into castings and worm tea. And what is a casting? Well, it is basically worm poop, but it's really similar to compost in that is an amazing amendment for your soil. So it has a lot of nutrients inside of it and it helps your plants and gardens grow big and strong. And one benefit about vermicomposting is it can be done year-round indoors, so you don't necessarily have to have a backyard or access to a wide open space to do it. If you live in an apartment, it's a really easy way to get your composting done. And it's also a great complement if you have a backyard compost pile or a food drop-off pickup, just to create less of that in case you are creating massive amounts of food waste. And worm castings, like regular compost, are still a really, really great thing to improve your soil structure, increase your water intention, and give your plants all of those really beneficial nutrients that they need to grow. And essentially how you vermicompost is you make a habitat for worms that mimics a little bit their natural environment, typically done in a bin like you can see on your screen here. So that will be the worm's home. That being said, what do you think you put inside of this bin here in order to make it a home? All right.
Do you want the next poll, Emily?
Yeah. The next poll, please, would be great. And it's okay to just guess anything you want here. What do you think makes up a worm's home? What are we putting inside of that bin in order to have those worms be happy and healthy and eat your food? All right, so I'm seeing one person has answered so far. I will let this poll go for a minute or so, and then we'll end it and read the answers. And it's okay to take your time and just think a lot about this. There's a lot of things that make up a worm's home, so there's no real answer that I would go at. So feel free to just say whatever you want.
One of the cool things, like Emily said about worm composting, is they're like perfect for apartments. I mean, I've lived in apartments much of my life, and that's how I've always composted my fruits and veg. And man,
Yep.
60 plus pounds of compost a year.
Yeah, I also live in an apartment and I do have a worm bin right now. And it's a great way for us to manage our food. So it has been a minute, so I just ended the poll. Rhonda, do you want to read those answers?
Definitely. So there's a dirt, shredded newspaper, question marks, maybe dirt and foods.
Great. Yeah. So this is all great answers. And I think a lot of this is getting at one of the components of vermicomposting, which is the bedding. And I will say a vermicompost bin is typically made of three main parts: the bedding itself, the worms inside, and the food that we put in it. And this brings us to my first rhyme, which is a worm's home has bedding just like you and me. Scraps of paper and cardboard to worms are comfy. So this is what they like living in. They do not like the sun, so they like to have places to hide and sleep just like us. We have a bed at night that we go in. Worms have a bed too, and it's made up of a lot of different material. But there are some other things that make up a worm bin. So when you are setting up a worm bin, there's a couple different styles you can choose from. I just have two examples here on the screen now. You can either do a tiered system, which we will watch how to make later, or you can just have a big old tub and use that to make your worms. But this system will always have a couple considerations or things that you want to keep in mind when you're making it. So one is the darkness level. As I said earlier, worms hate the sun. They hate bright lights. They want nothing to do with anything sunny. So you're going to want to have a bin that can stay relatively dark, keep it nighttime for them. You're also going to want to think about ventilation, or how are they getting air? Just like we need to breathe, worms need to breathe as well. So we need to make sure that that bin has a way for them to get air. You also want to think about drainage, and that's because as worms are eating your food, not only are they creating castings or their poop, but they're also creating the other one, and that will flow through to the bottom of the bin, and you should have a way to get that out. And you're also going to want to think about size. So the size of the bin that you have really depends on the amount of worms that you have. There is also an ideal ratio to vermicomposting, as there is for a more traditional type of compost, as I was talking about earlier. And that is a 2-to-1 ratio of worms to food in your bin. So moving on, this is what your bedding will be. It's really important, first and foremost, to get the bedding correct in a vermicompost bin, because those worms will not like it if their environment is not nice. Remember, just like in nature, worms need protection from the sun, they need to be kept moist, and they need help to move around. So vermicomposting bins use bedding to mimic that natural environment. And the bedding can be made from a lot of things, but often shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard, dry leaves are a good source of bedding. If you shred up an egg carton, or if you use any chemical-free paper towels, all of this can be used as bedding in your bin. And you're also going to want to make sure your bedding is slightly wet. So if you've ever left a sponge out on the sink for a period of time and pick it up after a while and it feels kind of wet, but not super wet, that's about the level of moisture or wetness you want in your bin, because the worms actually like living in a little bit more of a wet environment than a dry one. And if you're shredding up material, you're going to want to make sure they're no more than 1 inch thick. So how I think about that is my thumb is roughly 1 inch in size. So I don't want a piece of paper that is larger than that. And if you want to, you can always add a few handfuls of leaves from outside or just some soil itself, which will introduce some more microorganisms and things to the bin itself that worms can use. So I know this was a lot of information and some of you might want some videos or pictures. So let's move on to a short video that shows how to build a worm bin. All right, and all right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that little video. It has a really catchy song to it, but it basically shows how to make a tiered system for a worm bin. And right here is another example of that system, just kind of broken out into its parts. So we'll always have a base, and that's where you catch the water coming out of your system. So not only as your food breaks down, basically it'll turn into water sometimes, and the worms will also make it. So that just catches all of that. And as you saw from the video, that can be used with a mixture of water to water your plants because there's a lot of nutrients inside of that worm tea. And then the rest of the bin will be those layers. So this bin has 3 layers, and as you can see here, they're all in different portions of the process of vermicomposting. So that tray number 1 is the bin that you are adding to right now. So you can see here that the bedding is mainly shredded up newspaper in there, and the worms are currently eating and moving through that. And what they will create is something that looks kind of like tray 2 and tray 3. That is what castings look like. So they're also dark like compost. They are crumbly like compost. They can fall apart in your hand like compost, and they almost kind of look like coffee grounds if you've ever seen that. So that is what your castings look like, and that can be used for a lot of things. So I know we just focused a lot on the bedding, but one thing we haven't talked a lot about is what you add to that tray number 1, so the food that your worms eat. This brings us to my next rhyme, which is that in a worm bin, you'll find treats left by the humans. It's what worms like to eat. So red wiggler worms will eat a lot of our food that we don't want anymore, but they won't eat everything. It's also important to consider how much you're feeding your worms because, as you can imagine, they're a lot tinier than us, so we can't exactly eat as much as we can. So what I like to say is you can feed your worms roughly once a week, or if you have a lot of them, you can feed them up to every 2 days. But make sure there are days where you aren't giving your worms food. And when you have a bin itself, you're always going to want to add food to only one section or one side of the bin at the time. Now we can get into a little bit more on feeding worms and what they actually like to eat. So I consider worms to be vegan. They don't really want any meat, fish, or bones, but what they do really love is going to be your fruit and your vegetable scraps. And that's because worms have sensitive skin, so they don't really want anything super spicy or acidic. They're also a little bit picky and tend to eat mainly fruits and vegetables instead of sometimes foods that you would feed them, which we'll get to in a bit. But one note about feeding them fruits and vegetables is that some vegetables might smell when breaking down, whereas others won't. So something like broccoli in your worm bin might create a little bit of a smell as it's breaking down, but some other things will not. Sometimes foods are going to be things that are perfectly okay to feed your worms, but you don't want it to be making up the majority of their diet. So you don't want to be feeding them only these items. And that's going to be your coffee grounds, your tea, plain pasta and rice, raw potato, bread, and crushed eggshells. All of that is okay for your worms to eat, but they don't want too much of that in their diet. There are healthier things for those worms to eat. That brings us to the unhealthy things. So these are the nevers. As I said earlier, worms have extremely sensitive skin, so there are some things that you really don't want to put in your bin because it will actually hurt the worms. That's things like citrus. So while they like a lot of fruit, they do not want to eat any lemons or pineapples or oranges, things like that, because it will actually burn them. And that's painful for a worm. So that's a never, as well as onions, garlic, leeks, fats, oils, vinegar, and spicy or pickled foods. That's also not really healthy for the worms to be eating. So that is what you do not want to be putting in your bin. And it's important to keep in mind the ingredients that you're feeding your worms, because again, remember, we are creating an environment for them. We want them to be happy and healthy so they can continue eating and breaking down our food waste. That brings me to my next rhyme, which is without the right ratio of bedding to greens, the worms might drown or burn, become smithereens. So if you are not taking proper care of your worm bin, feeding them the right amount of food in the right portions, and taking care of their bedding, the worms might become smithereens. So we really want to make sure we are keeping a nice habitat for those worms inside of our worm bin, and keeping in mind that we're always going to want to have a ratio of 2 to 1 of worms to food. That being said, there are a lot of common mistakes people make. And if you're noticing any issues with your worm bin, that's nothing to get worried about. Often when you're composting in any form, no matter what it is, there are sometimes mistakes that happen. So it's just important to know steps to help those mistakes so they can become no longer problems. So these are some common problems in a worm bin. First and foremost, it's too smelly. So no one really wants a smelly worm bin. I'm sure the worms don't want a smelly worm bin either. If you are noticing smells coming from that bin itself, you're always first going to want to refresh that bedding. So again, worms want the ideal habitat, and that starts with their bedding itself. So make sure that bedding is looking nice and fresh. Make sure that there is no rotting food inside of that bin. And potentially, if you're noticing a lot of smells coming from there, you're going to want to avoid putting in any strong smelling foods inside of that bin. So as I said earlier, something like broccoli can smell as it's breaking down. If you're noticing that that scent is too strong for you, you can always take that out of the bin and put it somewhere else. Too smelly might also mean that there's not enough bedding inside of that bin. So if that food waste is breaking down, it'll just basically create a really horrible smelling juice. So you're going to want to add bedding or dry bedding in there just to make sure it has the right amount of water in there or its moisture level. Because again, the ideal moisture level for that worm bin is going to be like a wrung out sponge. Anything too dry won't make the worms happy, and anything too wet won't make the worms happy. And if the worms are unhappy, they will escape. So if you notice worms are escaping out of your bin, that most likely means they are unhappy inside of your bin. So always check the temperature and the moisture level inside of that bin. If it's too wet, again, the worms will want to leave. If it's too dry, the worms will want to leave. They'll also want to leave if the temperature is off. So worms do have an ideal temperature range. They like it between 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So if it is too cold outside and they're in a cold place, they will get really lethargic. They'll be tired all the time and they won't want to do anything. They won't want to move. Alternatively, if it's too hot outside, they'll be like, I'm burning, get me out of here. So they will try to leave your bin. So if you notice that, it's probably time to refresh that bedding itself. And just again, make sure that that bedding is perfectly happy for those worms so they won't try to leave. Another problem that you might be seeing is rotting food. So this will happen if you are, one, feeding your worms too much. So a simple solution to that is to just feed them less, reduce the amount of feeding. But it might also happen if the worms can't eat that food. So a solution to this could be just chopping up your food before you place it in your worm bin. Remember, red wiggler worms are really, really tiny. They are not as large as we are. So if you cut up that food itself, it actually makes it easier for them to eat that. Another solution could be freezing your food before you put it in your worm bin, so it'll actually thaw in there. And that can prevent some rotting, because rotting will happen naturally over time. So that's one way you can help prevent that and give your worms a chance to get to that food to eat it before it rots. Another common problem is going to be contamination, and this is largely going to be from plastic. So if you're in a grocery store, you probably see on your fruits and vegetables tiny little stickers on them. That is called a clue sticker, and that often ends up in any compost pile. So one way to help that is to sort out any clue stickers, take it off of your vegetables if you didn't eat them in time and you need to put them in your worm bin. And also make sure that as you are putting food inside of your worm bin, there's nothing harmful in there. So I know from time to time, people might accidentally drop a fork in their compost bin. Little tiny pieces of candy can end up in there, tiny pieces of plastic that just accidentally caught up in that. So make sure that you're sorting all of that out, because those contamination, things that shouldn't have been in there in the first place, will not break down with the rest of your food. So when you go to harvest those castings out of that bottom bin later, you will find potentially tiny pieces of plastic still there. And that's not really great. Another problem is going to want the unwanted visitors. So again, this is the worm's home. We are making a home for the worms. We are not making a home for fruit flies, and we are not making a home for mites. So if you notice fruit flies in your worm bin, you're going to want to get rid of them immediately. So one way to do that is just to reduce the amount you're feeding them, so feed them less. And you're also going to want to cover all of that food with a layer of bedding. Also, one thing that I like to do is to microwave that fruit and let it cool down before adding it to the bin. Fruit flies really start to come out because they have eggs inside of the fruit that we're eating already, often in like the outer layer of a banana, or even inside the fruit itself. And if you microwave that, that actually kills the larva or the eggs of those fruit flies, so they can't even hatch and become something new. So that's something to do if you have fruit flies, but really first you should just feed them less and make sure that you're refreshing that bedding. And then mites are also a common problem, and really what we're doing here is making sure that it's only going to be worms in your bin, not anything else that is taking over. Because again, this is a tiny little habitat, and if the mites take over, then there will be less worms. And we always want to make sure there's more worms than mites. So one thing that I've noticed, if there's little mites roaming around my bin, is that they love melon. So what I do is I chop up a watermelon, I put it in that bin, I wait for those mites to go, this is a really tasty treat, run over to it, bite onto it, and then I just take that melon out, wash it out and remove the mites, put it back in, and then rinse and repeat until there are no mites left inside of my bin. That is found to work. So again, we really only want worms to be the main microorganism in here, or tiny little critter moving around. There might be others from time to time, like roly-polies, or a couple mites is okay, but if you notice any other species becoming the main thing inside of that bin, you're going to want to manage that to make sure it is truly a worm bin. So moving on, I do have a special treat for you in my next slide. And this is basically what it looks like if you have a successful worm bin. So worms as a whole are super powerful. And let's see what they can do to a pumpkin. So, as we saw from there, those worms absolutely ate that entire pumpkin just in roughly 60 days. So, if you have a healthy worm bin, you can find that your red wigglers will eat crazy things that you never thought they could eat. So, that being said, does anyone have any questions?
Don't see any questions out there, but feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Mhm.
And if not, then I think that we can, that was great. I know I learned a bunch of stuff. The microwaving, never thought of that to keep fruit flies down.
Yeah.
So that's good. Oh, where did you get the worms?
Good question. Yeah. So I actually buy my worms online. Um, and that's because I really want to make sure that I am getting red wigglers. So I look up online, red wiggler is the species that you want. Its scientific name is Icenia fetida. Anything other than that doesn't have as wide an appetite, so it won't eat everything that you put in the bin. But Icenia fetida or those red wiggler worms will eat most of anything. They have the widest appetite out of any of the worm species. So I just look up red wiggler worms online. I think I got them from Maymay's Worms the last time. And I got them in the mail, and the mailman was a little bit confused that I got a live shipment of worms, but you know, you have to do what you have to do. I've also heard sometimes bait shops have some red wigglers available. So if you have any local bait shops, you could go check to see if they have red wigglers.
Also out there is like, so you can't use just regular garden worms, huh?
No, you can't really use garden worms for this. So garden worms are going to be a different type of species that don't really eat any of what you want the worms to be eating. So really, really take those red wigglers. Garden worms may eat some food, but they won't, again, eat everything. So red wigglers are the way to go.
All right. Yeah, and there's another question about like what problems would other worms cause. So
They
yeah,
won't eat everything, so you notice a lot of rotting food sitting in your worm bin.
yeah. And these worms typically are like they're surface dwellers and
Mhm.
they're kind of communal worms, whereas like the big fat night crawlers here
Yeah.
are definitely solo.
Yeah,
And
night
they like
crawlers will want to burrow. Um, and night crawlers will, in the wild, burrow like 6 feet underground. So in a tiny little worm tower, they're not really going to be able to do their natural behavior. And again, what we want to do is mimic what they're doing naturally inside of that worm bin.
Are these worms expensive?
So it depends, I guess, on what you think expensive is. Um, I bought 5 pounds of worms the last time for about $50. So if you think that's worth it, that's about how much they cost.
That's pretty good because I've bought the last time I had to buy worms, it was like 38 or 40 bucks a pound.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So I mean
maybe it
I
depends on
don't
the
mind them
seller.
happen because your worms, as long as you make them happy, they're gonna make more
Oh,
worms.
yeah. They will
Yeah.
make babies. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, let's see here. Another question is 2 to 1 is the ratio, but is that worms to pounds of food or pounds of worms to pounds of food or something else?
Pounds. Yeah, it is pounds of worms to pounds of food.
Awesome. Great questions out there, guys. Are there easy alternatives to using plastic for the bin system?
Um, yeah, there are, I think. As long as it's like an enclosed container, I think it can be made out of anything. Typically I do find that they are plastic containers though, probably because plastic is a pretty cheap material to make things out of. If anyone of you knows any worm bin system that's not made of plastic, please show.
Yeah,
Ah,
a friend of mine makes them out of wood.
nice. Yeah.
Seen them made out of wood. Back here, I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but this is a bag. It's called the Urban Worm Bag. I'm not trying to sell its products or anything, but Steve's pretty awesome out of Philly. And that was that I brought from home. So I'm in my office now, but that is a pretty cool setup. So that's not plastic, it's pliable. You can harvest from the bottom. There's no
Great.
bin changing out, which I spent years doing that in my home system. So not cheap. I mean, it was like maybe a little over $100 for that. But for me, it was well worth it. The cost, because yeah, I mean, the frame is plastic, it's PVC, and metal, but the bag itself is, I mean, I want to say that it's canvas, but I'm not exactly sure the material it's made out of. But yeah, wood is another one. I wouldn't do metal because I think that would heat up a little too much.
I think so. Yeah. I've never seen a metal vermicompost bin, but it's cool that there are cloth options and wood options.
Yeah. Which of the 3 bins is the bedding in? Is it the middle or the second one?
Good question. So all of them at one point in time did have bedding. As your worms move through, they will eat both the food and the bedding itself and turn it into those castings. So the castings are a mix of that food and that bedding.
And I've always found too that when you have that like different like tray systems going on, the worms are gonna move to wherever the food is.
Yeah.
Like you oh, it's filling up with with worm compost, then you stick another layer on the top with just the food in it. They're gonna wiggle themselves way up into that food layer. And then that way it leaves that middle layer and the bottom layers all to compost. And you'll find your own rhythm. It took me a while to figure out how I wanted to rotate stuff around, but yeah. And I think that wraps up the questions. And we're like a minute out, so that was perfect.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming to our first in this series.
Be sure to join us tomorrow, same time,
Yeah.
for a little recycle and write what goes in the blue bin. And I can't wait to take you on that journey.
Woohoo. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Emily. I definitely learned a lot of new stuff for worm composting. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. I love worms. What can I say?
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.